Hi there. Ed Anton asked me to do a little sharing about my background and knowledge of the Mainline Church of Christ and how church autonomy on a local scale and any type of cooperation on a broader scale actually worked. And I'll give us a look at history there and talk about what it was like in the early days, phases it went through, where I think things are now, because I understand that we are going to talk about how we can cooperate better in our movement in order to carry out the Great Commission more effectively and a number of other things that we want to do. It's my understanding that my good buddy Valder Koha is going to be talking about it from the standpoint of the ICOC. Of course, he brings in a business background. He brings in his work with the New England European churches and their funding. He brings in the Beam Fund, that he's been the chairman of the board of, I think, both those groups. So anyway, he'll have some things to say, and since he and I talk a lot about this subject, I'm sure that what he says is going to be pretty much what I would say if I were talking about that side of things. But what can we learn from the Mainline Church of Christ? They definitely had a strong focus on autonomy as a congregation, but how did they cooperate? And are there examples or insights that we can learn from? And I think perhaps so. I, of course, spent many years in the group. I taught restoration history in a ministry training school. I have friends and relatives in the Mainline Church. I have connections. I've even spoken some and been to some of those groups since I got back to Texas. And so I do have some perspectives to share that maybe will be helpful. Historically, if we go back to the days of the early restoration movement and say after the split off in the early 1900s, after the instrumental music issue became a problem, then of course we divided there into about three groups. But prior to that, the real restoration movement was going strongly in the early 1800s, even before that. But you had two big names, Alexander Campbell and Barton W. Stone, that had the biggest groups, and they managed somehow to merge together along with some other groups. But the idea was, of course, to go back and restore the original church and its teachings and not be like the Reformation movement that had split into about 150 different groups by 1700. And the interesting thing to me is, regarding cooperation, these groups were pretty different. Stone was kind of a Holy Spirit guy, and some of the things that went on at some of their camp meetings would be a little shocking to us probably. On the other hand, Campbell was a real intellectual, very academic, non-emotional in his approach, and yet the two groups managed to join together along with some other groups that love the concept of restoration. They managed to do that in spite of the differences. So that meant they had a common goal that drove them to do it, and that goal, of course, was to go back to the Bible and make a church like the one that Jesus originally started. But from the beginning, they definitely had the idea of autonomy in the local church. They didn't start that way. They were actually going to do more like denominations did and have some kind of a written document that would join them together in a creed, but they dispensed with that very quickly and became very strongly oriented to having congregational autonomy. And it was mainly just because they didn't want to see happen in their efforts what had happened in the Reformation movement. And that was that a board or a leading group in that denomination could decide what was going to be done, and it had to be done. Regardless of whether the local churches liked it or didn't, the leaders in those, they still had to do it. And so the idea was, if we didn't have that kind of connection and were autonomous, then one rotten apple could not spoil the whole bunch. And that was an illustration that I used in talking about why we were autonomous. But the thing striking to me in the earliest days is that they put together quite a couple of movements, several movements, because they had a common goal of restoration. So that principle there should teach us something. As we go from there, in the early beginnings, they had different ones in their groups that had influence. And since it was a lot of a rural setting, then guys like Campbell and other people that wrote periodicals, they had the greatest influence. And of course, Campbell did a lot of debating, and that gave him a lot of influence as well. But they were pretty scattered out, and the ones that wrote were the ones with the greatest influence. So depending on what they thought should be done, if they had enough influence, they could persuade others to cooperate in some way to do some of these things. So, just to give you an idea, as history unfolded, they did the debates in which they would debate someone over the issue of baptism or atheism or whatever else. Campbell himself was a great debater, and he started off debating about infants or adults being baptized, sprinkling or immersion, and definitely debated those things as well as some others. But people would come from all over the country to hear him debate and to learn from what he was doing. So there was a cooperative effort in some way with the debates. Then you had these camp meetings that I mentioned early on, mainly the Stone movement, but they had the camp meetings in which people would come from long distances and spend 2 to 3 weeks together and just have camp for the whole group. Kids, adults, everyone, and those were definitely cooperative in that sense that they had to communicate and agree to all come together and to somehow finance what was going to be done. Then the proverbial gospel meeting that became very popular and carried on for a really long time was their way of evangelizing at least once a year. They'd have a speaker come in, and they started off maybe going a couple of weeks and then 1 week and then a long weekend. And I, of course, attended and preached for many of those, but that was a cooperative effort to some degree, because normally the churches in an area would sort of support it, even if one local congregation actually sponsored it. You did have some cooperation in the gospel meetings, and prior to that, tent meetings, brush arbor meetings, but sometimes that would be not just a local church, but an entire region where they would work hard to get people to come in and hear, and they baptized a ton of people that way. It was very effective back in its earlier days. Then we started building Christian colleges, and there would be activities connected with the colleges, like Christian college lectureships. And I've been to many of those, as a number of you have as well. And that was to some degree a cooperative effort, although the financial end of it was mainly people paying their way to get there and their lodging once they were there, and perhaps some kind of a registration fee. But it was not a big cooperative thing financially for the most part, but rather just getting people there to have an encouraging big meeting. Then the mission portion of what was done in the mainline group, it had sort of 2 phases. The biggest phase was starting churches in every town and community possible. And so sometimes one big church would start another church in a nearby community. Sometimes 2 or 3 churches would go together and in some sense cooperate by sending members and maybe money to start a new group. And in the South, this was extremely effective as far as getting churches started back in those earlier days. People have asked me now, they say, I drive through these little towns in Texas and every last one of them has a Church of Christ in it. How did that happen? Well, it happened because that was their mission emphasis in many, many ways. Then after World War II, there got to be more and more of an understanding of how big the world was and how much the world needed evangelized. And so they began to send missionaries, and that could be done by one church if it was a big church and had the money, or it might be done by several smaller churches, in which case they figured out it would be good to send our money to one church and let them send one check over to the missionary for his salary and for whatever else was needed. And so that church that collected the money from the other few would be called a sponsoring church. And that was still popular in the days I was in the mainline, and I think still maybe today. But those were sort of the two mission phases that they cooperated in. But it wasn't so much that they did world missions, although they got into that more and more, but that didn't last a really long time. I remember when I moved to Boston in 1988, I think it was in the year 1990, I read an article written by Gerald Payton, who's now deceased, but he was one of the Payton brothers that taught at the Sunset School of Preaching. And he talked about mission work, and he said that the high water mark of the Church of Christ missions outside the U.S. was sometime in the 70s. It was either around 70, 75, somewhere in the early 70s. And he said that at that point, they had 800 mission units outside the U.S. in mission work. And a unit was either a couple or a single person. And he said by the end of the year 1990, when he wrote the article, that number would have dropped from 800 down to below 200. And so you definitely had a strong cooling off process as far as mission work went. People ask, why was that so? And I would say they lost their evangelistic zeal, number one, and number two, everyone got into building buildings. We had to have new buildings, bigger buildings, build gymnasiums for the kids, et cetera, and that sort of thing began to happen back when I was still pretty early on in ministry, some 40-some years ago, and they definitely took a downward path. When you look at all of the other things that they once did, the mainline church today does very few of those things. For example, debates. They don't want to do anything that would call attention to themselves being too different from other people, at least most of them. And so debates have probably been gone for decades. The idea of foreign missions, we've mentioned. The gospel meeting type of approach to trying to evangelize. Perhaps some of the older churches out in the country still do that just because they do almost everything traditionally that was done 50 years ago. So probably some of that's still going on with very little effectiveness, I would guess, based on my own experience years ago when I was in it. Then the lectureships, that's still going on. There were a number of us that went to the 2004 Abilene Christian University lectureship, and there were quite a number of people there. I don't know how many were there, but several thousand. But when we came together at night, you noticed that almost everyone was old and white and gray-headed. And nothing against people in that category, since I'm in the category, but it was disheartening not to see more people of color and not to see a younger crowd, but they still are doing the lectureships. There was also another thing that started, two things that started that to me are sort of unique in churches cooperating together. One of those would be what they call soul winning workshops. And that started, I think, at Tulsa. They had a very big one there. Thousands of people came to that. And they had other smaller ones all across the nation. And the focus was on saving souls, helping people get right with God. That was back when bus ministry was a big thing. Everyone thought if we could bus these kids in, we'll convert them when they're old enough, we'll pull their parents in, and that was a big deal. And really behind a lot of the early soul-winning workshops, that idea turned out not to be a good one as far as the overall effect of it in time. But anyway, the soul-winning workshops were a big thing. And a number of us were sort of on the circuit, and we went to quite a few of those and spoke. And they were designed to fire people up about evangelism. And so that took some cooperation to get people there. Financially, probably some as well, but that was an effort that was a pretty interesting one. Then you had something like a crusade. Billy Graham, of course, was very active during those years. And I remember when my wife and I got involved really seriously in the mainline, that was in the late 1960s. And so they had some campaign type things in which all the churches of a local area would cooperate. They would knock doors, they would hand out printed material, they would ask people to study the Bible, and then it all culminated with a big meeting. And so you'd have some outside speaker come in to a Coliseum type setting where you could get thousands of people there, and he would preach and many would be baptized. We also had some TV shows in which we would show a film that was designed to get people's interest. And then we would, in a number of cases, have a live panel. And you'd have people answering phones, handing us notes with the questions on them, and we would answer Bible questions live as a part of that TV presentation. Not only the movie part of it or the short story part of it, but also the live panel. And that was done in my hometown of Shreveport, Louisiana, when my wife was pregnant with our son, who's 49, I think, next month. And so we're looking at 50 years ago. But that was a big deal, and the churches did cooperate. And they had to cooperate financially because it took a lot of bucks to rent the facilities, to do the TV show, etc. The man that later proved to be one of my mentors in the Northwest, J.T. Bristow, directed what they called Impact Christ in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, which was a big deal. He did it twice up in the Northwest where we were in the Portland, Oregon area, and we tried to use the same approach. Knock doors, invite people, try to study with them, get them to watch the TV program and the live panel, and then have an outside speaker come in and preach and baptize a number of people. And so we did that 2 years. The second year we didn't have so much success raising the funds, and so the outside speaker happened to be me. So I wasn't outside and I wasn't well known in one sense, but I was a medium-sized fish perhaps in a small pond, a really small pond in the Northwest. But things, of course, have gone down a lot from all of those days. The soul-winning workshops pretty well ceased. It did lead to the Florida Evangelism Seminar, which was that type of thing, or the Rocky Mountain Evangelism Seminar. Those were actually offshoots of the mainline's version of that. And they eventually, though, in the mainline were destined to pretty much die. I think they may still hold one in Tulsa. They do not call it Soul Winning Workshop. If you look at the program, which I have, it is mainly about taking care of the needs within the churches of Christ rather than a focus on outreach. I could mention that I see a similar pattern in our movement, that we are less emphasizing evangelism and more focused on all kinds of different needs, which are valid needs. But if we do it at the expense of the evangelism, that is concerning. Revelation 2 and 3 is always going to have some effect. People are going to lose their first love. They're going to become lukewarm. The mainline Church of Christ has declined dramatically over a period of years. I remember in my second edition of Prepared to Answer, I used a Christian Chronicle article from 2009, and they admitted that their number of congregations in the mainline Church of Christ had decreased by nearly 600, as I recall it was, and then with the number of members, it had decreased by 78,000 plus within a 6-year period. And so it's that sort of stagnation that makes us want to learn ways that we can cooperate to carry out both parts of the Great Commission, but to cooperate in a great way. I didn't mention that within the mainline Churches of Christ in the 50s and 60s, they had a fairly major division. We called them the anti-cooperation churches. They call themselves now the non-institutional group. And guys like F. LaGard Smith, that some of you know and have met, and F. LaGard Smith is in that group. And so they took autonomy to the nth degree. Doctrinally, that's a very interesting story. I don't have time to tell. But anyway, we had our own split, of course, from the ICOC into the ICC. I don't think that's so much our big problem. I think we do have a trust problem that has limited us in how much we cooperate together as a broader group, as a whole movement. And I think that is our fear of any kind of hierarchy of leadership. And I would have to ask the question that I've asked 1,000 times or 500,000 or whatever it's been. Anything that you look at and question and are afraid of and don't trust, you have to ask the question, are we talking about something that is wrong within itself? Or, on the other hand, are we talking about something that is good that was implemented in a wrong way? Whether it is evangelism or finances or discipling or cooperation or whatever. Is it a wrong thing or a good thing done a wrong way that has caused us to be fearful and lose our trust? I assume Valder will address that some, so I will shut up. That is not my area that I was supposed to talk about, but the Mainline Church of Christ at some points did have some cooperation that went on when they had a common goal that was strong enough to entice interest and participation. That's pretty well gone now in the Mainline movement. And we're asking ourselves, what should we do? What can we do? What does God want us to do to cooperate more? And that's a good discussion, and I hope a lively one. And to whatever degree this has contributed, amen. Thanks very much.